This is a question from a listener who got in touch via Spotify, but we don't know their name. They ask, looking at the polling for a ceasefire in Gaza, it seems like foreign policy is the area where Westminster is most out of touch with public opinion. Why is this?
Okay, well, this is a really interesting question. Obviously, we've talked quite a bit about the divisions within Labour, but there's been developments since then. Keir Starmer made a speech to clarify his position. Actually, he was sort of doubling down on his refusal to call for a ceasefire, wasn't he?
Yeah, completely. I think he had his big speech on Tuesday where he basically set out the reasons that he's not going to call for a ceasefire. Yeah. I think the big surprise within the party is that it took so long for this to happen. Lots of MPs were texting me or querying why this hadn't come 10 days before, when you've had this huge eruption of discontent within the party, which you've spoken about a lot on the podcast. And then he also, alongside those reasons, set out his principles for managing the situation if he were in office. He made it clear that he wants Israel to stop the illegal settlements in the West Bank. He also recommitted the party to a two-state solution. He was also quite critical of diplomacy in the past 10 or 20 years, he said, so he included that New Labour period as well, in the failure to move towards a diplomatic solution when we saw some progress in the 90s and early noughties. So he was quite critical and also quite ambitious about what he thought he could achieve if he became Prime Minister. What he didn't do and what he darted around was the question of how on earth the UK has the power within international affairs to bring this about. He didn't exactly say what would happen if Israel doesn't listen to the leader of the opposition, or if he did become Prime Minister, the Prime Minister. So that was less clear. But yeah, it was essential that he did this just because the unrest within his party was getting so extensive.
Yeah, and there was a hint in the speech that position could evolve as events develop, which I took to mean basically when Washington calls for a ceasefire, we'll do it too.
Over time, the facts on the ground will inevitably change in relation to both hostages being rescued and Hamas's capability to carry out attacks like we saw on October the 7th. And we must move to cessation of fighting as quickly as possible.
And I suppose it's the same on the UK government side. It's not just Labour who have made these calculations.
Yeah, quite. So his argument for not calling for a ceasefire was that Hamas still have hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza, so therefore they should be able to act militarily to rescue those hostages. He said that may change, but yeah, I completely agree, Anoosh. Some in the party did think this was a shift to the left or a shift to their position. Mm. I think it was just a reflection of the fact that the Labour's foreign policy at the moment is very happy to sit under the aegis of America and also to build consensus with the government.
Yeah, and our questioner has asked specifically about these, the position of both the government and Labour clashing with public opinion, which is more sympathetic towards a ceasefire. And many frontbenchers, I think 16 frontbenchers have called for a ceasefire, representing the views of their constituents and the people that they're hearing from. How sustainable is it going to be for Starmer not to sort of sack them for crossing the party line?
Yeah, I was speaking to some people close to Starmer, and I think their approach so far is basically to see this as a one-off, to let people voice their concerns, as you say, represent their constituents and also their consciences, and then try and seal this off and not let this bleed into other issues as well. I mean, I think that's probably achievable just because people don't feel as passionately about some other issues. We haven't seen the same amount of unrest over the two-child benefit cap, for instance, which did have some, but nowhere near the same extent. And also because we have to remember that Labour's on the verge of power, and lots of MPs and ministers want to be in governmental positions if that happens, and they don't want to be on the backbenches. So that's just the nuts and bolts of it. But then back to the question of why there might be this dissonance between the public and the government. So I think this is referring to a poll that essentially says that 70 or 75% of people want a ceasefire, whereas the government and Keir Starmer haven't called for one. They've called for humanitarian pauses to allow aid to get in. I think there is dissonance there, sure, but we've also seen a lot of alignment between the public and the government on things like Ukraine. That support has always been there for the government's mission and also for Labour's position. Why don't you see it here? I think lots of people look at the horrors that are going on and think we need this to stop, and then they associate that with a ceasefire. I think the mantra or the conversation might change slightly. Now we've had this video from a Hamas leader basically saying that they want to do the attack again and again. That completely undermines the argument for a ceasefire, and I think some in Labour will look at that and potentially reconsider. But there's always this disconnect, I think, between the public and the government or the political parties on foreign policy. And as we always say, I don't think foreign policy drives political opinion in this country in a way that it has potentially in the 20th century or in the past. It's just not at the forefront of people's minds.
Yeah, and I think it's a simple case of compassion, isn't it? Because the most ways that people who perhaps aren't part of either community that's directly affected will be consuming this war, if you like, is watching the terrible clips that you see on the news. And of course, the idea of ceasefire, i.e. no conflict, is the most attractive option. So I think perhaps polling in that area isn't necessarily super helpful unless it tracks a change in public opinion over time when you see various developments coming out, like you mentioned. So I'm not sure necessarily if that's going to be the driver for how politicians act. Usually politicians are obsessed with public opinion, aren't they? But on things like these foreign policy positions, they're thinking much more about how much influence does Britain have? How aligned does it have to be with America? Those are the general considerations.
I suppose there is one way in which it could become a broader domestic political issue, which would be if the conflict broadens, it has the potential to become a second Ukraine in terms of energy prices. We have seen a rise or a reversal in the trend, the previous downward trend in oil prices. We've seen gas prices rise as a result of Israel closing a large gas field in the Mediterranean for security concerns. Were it to spread to, more involvement with Iran, then that would have a significant effect on energy prices, which would affect us in a similar way to Russia's war in Ukraine, perhaps not as extreme an effect, but it wouldn't need to be as extreme to have a significant effect on inflation and that kind of thing in this country. So, yeah, I can see how it's an issue in which the public can't see why politicians would prevaricate, whereas politicians are perhaps thinking about wider, more long-term potential results of intervention.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.